In 1931, a fishing trawler called the Kalinda was dragging its nets across the bottom of the North Sea, in open water, dozens of miles from any coastline. What came up in that net didn't belong there. A barbed antler point, carved by human hands, hauled up from a seabed that everyone at the time agreed had always been open ocean. Fishermen had been finding things like it for generations: mammoth teeth, antler tools, fragments of bone, and mostly laughed it off as junk. This time, someone took it seriously. What they eventually uncovered wasn't a shipwreck. It was an entire vanished world, a forgotten landmass the size of a small country, swallowed by the sea thousands of years before the first pyramid was built. And when scientists finally read the DNA buried in its mud, they found a population history no written record on Earth had ever preserved. At the end of the last ice age, Britain wasn't an island. It was the western edge of a vast, low-lying plain connecting it directly to what is now the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Rivers ran through it. Forests grew across it. People hunted, fished, and built lives on it for thousands of years, on ground that today sits under as much as 200 feet of the North Sea. Archaeologists call it Doggerland, named after Dogger Bank, a sandbank that marks its highest surviving point. For most of modern history, it wasn't even a footnote. It wasn't in any school textbook. It wasn't part of any nation's origin story. It was simply erased. Not by war, not by conquest, but by water, rising so slowly across so many centuries that the people living through it may barely have noticed the coastline moving in their own lifetimes. It has no ruins you can visit, no monuments, only mud, sediment, and buried inside that mud, molecules that shouldn't have survived at all. For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus on Doggerland was almost dismissive. It was assumed to be a cold, marginal tundra, a bleak, transitional strip that a few hardy hunter-gatherers might have crossed, but never a place anyone would call home for long. Full submersion was placed at somewhere around 7,000 years ago, the result of a slow, gradual creep of rising seawater as the last ice age's glaciers melted away. It was treated, in other words, as background scenery, not a civilization, not a homeland, a puddle that used to be dry land, populated by a handful of nomads passing through on their way to somewhere that mattered more. That assumption held for decades, repeated in textbook after textbook, because there was almost nothing to test it against. No bones to speak of, no settlements to excavate, just mud at the bottom of one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. Then genetic science learned how to read mud. In 2026, a team led by geneticist Robin Allaby at the University of Warwick published a study that rewrote the timeline of this vanished world entirely. Instead of searching for bones, they extracted what's called sedimentary ancient DNA, genetic fragments preserved directly in mud and silt, pulled from more than 50 sediment cores across the seafloor. What they found didn't just add detail, it broke the old picture apart. Oak, elm, and hazel forests were growing across southern Doggerland more than 16,000 years ago, thousands of years earlier than any forest record from Britain itself. Lime trees, which need real warmth to survive, showed up 2,000 years before they appear anywhere in the British archaeological record. This wasn't frozen tundra. Parts of Doggerland were a warm, sheltered refuge, growing thick, temperate forest, while the surrounding uplands of Britain and Europe were still locked in cold. And alongside the plant DNA, traces of a small number of actual human genomes, recovered separately from individuals dated between roughly 9,100 and 6,500 BC, carried signatures matching Western hunter-gatherer populations, with maternal lineages dominated by a genetic marker called haplogroup U. A landscape assumed to be empty and marginal turned out to be one of the richest, most habitable environments in Ice Age Europe. Here's where the story stops being tidy. The forest DNA pushed the beginning of Doggerland's story back thousands of years earlier than anyone expected. But it also pushed the ending later than the old consensus claimed. Full submersion now looks to have happened closer to 6,000 years ago, not 7,000. A landscape that was supposed to be barren was thriving thousands of years earlier than believed. And a landmass that was supposed to have drowned earlier held on for another 1,000 years longer than the textbook said. The old simple timeline, cold, empty, gone early, was wrong at both ends at once. Three explanations are now competing to describe what Doggerland actually was, and none of them has been fully proven or fully ruled out. The first says Doggerland wasn't a transitional wasteland at all. It was a genuine population center, quite possibly one of the largest concentrations of people in Ice Age Northern Europe, sustained by rivers, forests, and coastline, all in one place, hiding in plain sight beneath what looked to modern eyes like empty ocean. Under this theory, the in-between land bridge everyone imagined was, in reality, somewhere people spent thousands of years actually calling home. The second theory points to a single, sudden catastrophe layered on top of that slow-rising tide. The Storega event, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway around 6200 BC that triggered a tsunami capable of devastating the low-lying coasts of Doggerland in a matter of hours, not centuries. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting this catastrophe may be distantly echoed in later flood folklore across Northern Europe, though that link remains speculative, resting on cultural memory far older than any written record could confirm. The third theory is the quietest, and in some ways the most humbling, that we still don't actually know how much of Doggerland's population survived into the people living on these coastlines today. Some ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry clearly persists in later European populations, but direct, demonstrable continuity between Doggerland's own inhabitants and the modern populations of Britain and the Netherlands has not yet been established. The genetic trail so far is suggestive, not conclusive. A hidden homeland, a sudden catastrophe, or a population whose fate is still, genuinely, unknown. Right now, the mud isn't finished telling its story. What makes Doggerland different from almost everything else this show has covered is that it wasn't erased by conquest, by persecution, or by a false name imposed from outside. It was erased by nothing more dramatic than water, rising by inches, over centuries, until an entire population's homeland simply stopped being land. No army ever conquered it. No empire ever ruled it. It just kept being smaller, generation after generation, until the last dry patch of it disappeared beneath a sea that today carries oil tankers and fishing trawlers directly over what were once someone's forests, someone's rivers, someone's home. So what was Doggerland, really? A lost homeland? A sudden tragedy? Or a population history we still haven't fully recovered? The honest answer today is that it may have been all three, at different moments, for different people living there across 4,000 years of slowly disappearing coastline. The forests were real. The families were real. Whether their sudden ending came from a wave or simply from time running out, the sea kept its secret for longer than any civilization it swallowed. Somewhere under the North Sea tonight, a piece of someone's home is still sitting in the mud, waiting for the right core sample to bring it back into the light. Every people this series has covered left a mark loud enough that someone, eventually, went looking for it. A legend, a name, a monument. Doggerland left nothing but mud and molecules, and even that very nearly wasn't enough. If an entire homeland can disappear this completely and still leave a trace precise enough to be read 10,000 years later, it raises an uncomfortable question. How much of everyone else's history has already vanished this quietly, with no one left to even ask the question? An entire country's worth of land disappeared, and it took 10,000 years and a fishing net to even notice. Subscribe to Blood and History. You have no idea what else is still buried.